You guys know when we started off the year, we started back in the beginning of the Bible. And I got to tell you, I've really enjoyed going through this with you guys. I say with you guys because I've gotten to hear from so many of you how Genesis has impacted you and your life. And we are going to be stopping today. This is kind of the end of the beginning because next Sunday and, of course, Resurrection Sunday, all focus and direction is going to be on Jesus and what he did for us on the cross, including Good Friday. But what I want you guys to see, and what I hope you see, is that every single week of this year, every single sermon has led up to today as a springboard for what we're about to celebrate with Palm Sunday, Good Friday, and Resurrection Sunday. And what we're talking about today is that promised son. The promised son whose name was Isaac, and what he meant to this couple, and then we're going to take beyond that and look at what the promised son of Jesus means to all of us even today. We got a lot of ground to cover. We're doing Genesis 17, 18, 20, 21, and 22. So no, we are not going to go verse by verse because we'd be here all day. But I am going to go through and summarize some and go verse by verse through some, talking about who this promised son was and what he meant to this couple. Starting with Genesis 17, to give you guys a little context, a little background. Remember last week we were talking about Hagar and Ishmael and that child, and you should know that 13 years passed after the birth of Ishmael. And 13 years later, God shows up to Abram and says, I'm still going to give you a lot of kids. Remember, he's given that covenant of seed, of descendants, and God shows up 13 years later after that son is sent away, right, and says, I'm still going to do this. And he also, at the same time, he renames Abram. He adds a just a real little change that had a pretty significant name difference. Before, if you remember, Abram's name meant exalted father. Abraham means father of a throng of nations. So now he's like an exalted father whose kids are just going to have a lot of power, a lot of influence over the course of the world. This is a really powerful name change that God gives him. The other thing that shows up in Genesis 17 is the covenant of circumcision. We are not going to talk about that in detail for a number of obvious reasons, but you do have to know it's there, and you do have to know it's a covenant that, yes, Abraham did honor and keep. The other thing that happened is we're going to talk about Abram, right, getting a name change to Abraham. Sarai gets her own name change, and she goes from Sarai to Sarah. She gets a as well. That I drops down, the H pops up, and it's not a huge change. The biggest thing it did is, you remember Sarai was my princess? Sarah is kind of just formal princess, like princess with a capital P. I almost picture here God formalized and says, Abram, your wife is going to be a princess for me. And then what he says very specifically, he says, I'm going to bless her with a son. With a son. So not just a child, you're going to have a son, and it is going to come from Sarah. And Abraham does what every single person would do, right, when they find out their wife is pregnant. Falls on his face laughing. Now, I bring this up because so often when everyone talks about this story, they remember Sarah's reaction. And we're going to talk about Sarah's reaction. But everyone forgets about this one. Abraham, when he found out that his wife was going to be pregnant with a son, he hit the floor laughing. Now, I don't know about you guys. I've heard a lot of funny stuff. I have never fallen on my face laughing. And this is Abraham's response to finding out that his wife number one, is going to have a child. And in response, to prove that he has a sense of humor, God says, and you're going to name him Isaac. He laughs. He laughs. And we're going to talk about that name as we go through this story this morning. So after all this happens, we've got Abraham, and he's sitting in his tent in the middle of the day, and it leads us to Genesis 18, verse 1. And Yahweh was seen by him by the oaks of Mamre as he was sitting at the entrance to his tent at the heat of the day. And so where we find Abraham at this point is it's really, really hot. And so back then, right, the heat of the day is when they generally did not work because no one's got air conditioning. And they would take a break. They would take a rest. He's probably been working all morning. And this is just before he would take his afternoon siesta. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever experienced the siesta culture, but it is pretty amazing. There are still parts of the world, right, where they honor this. They actually take a break and they take a nap and they pause before the rest of the day. Unfortunately, the United States doesn't really follow this, right? But for these people, they did. They actually took an afternoon siesta. So this is where we find Abraham. He's hot. He's tired. He's about to take a break until three guys show up. Verses 2 and 3. He lifted up his eyes and saw here 3 men standing over against him. When he saw them, he ran to meet them from the entrance to his tent and bowed to the earth and said, "My lords, pray if I have found favor in your eyes. Pray do not pass by your servant." So even though he's tired and exhausted, he runs out to meet these 3 men. And you notice I put men in quotes. Kind of like 3 mystery men. And we know Abraham recognized them because he's all excited. He refers to them as lords, which means rulers. Right? He sees them as more important than he is, and he actually bows down before them. So before he's on his face laughing, now he's down on his face worshiping these 3 men because he knows something about them. And he says, "Stay. Please stay." He recognizes they're passing by. He could have let them go. He could have thought, "Man, I'm too tired to deal with this." But he didn't. He said, "Please stay." And to induce them to stay, he says what he says in verses 4 and 5. "Pray, let a little water be fetched, then wash your feet, and recline under the tree. Let me fetch you a bit of bread, that you may refresh your hearts. Then afterward you may pass on, for you have, after all, passed your servant's way." They said, "Do thus as you have spoken." In other words, why not? Right? So Abraham, what he does here is he literally and physically waited on the Lord. He knew that if you want someone to stay, you serve them. He had to convince these guys, don't just pass by, I want you to stay with me. And he knows if you do that, you want that to happen, you've got to serve someone. This is a really profound truth that should impact our relationships. You want your loved ones to stay? Serve them. Yeah, your spouses. Yeah, your kids. Yeah, your close friends. Yes, your coworkers. You want someone to stay? Serve them. So what does this mean for the church? If we want people to stay, we got to serve them. And that should be a mutual thing. Now, what does it mean for the people who aren't in the church? Same answer, right? If we want people to come, they need to be served. People are attracted to those who serve them. And Abraham got this. And we as a church need to get this. If you want someone to stay, serve them. And so he does, and he gets really, really excited. Verse 6 says Abraham hastened into his tent to Sarah and said, "Make haste. 3 measures of choice flour. Knead it. Make bread cakes." Notice all the exclamation points. Like he's really excited, right? And he goes in, he gets Sarah a little bit involved, but only sort of. Notice he goes in, he's all fired up. He just tells her what to do. He doesn't tell her who. Doesn't tell her why. If I was at home and my wife came in and started yelling out orders of do this, do that, I'd be like, wait, why now? For who? You know, I might do it, but I'd have a lot of questions about why are we doing this? Why are you so fired up? And you know, we hear any of that from Sarah. She cooperates and she does exactly what she's asked to do, just to reveal her humility. Verses 7 and 8. Abraham ran to the oxen. He fetched a young ox, tender and fine, and gave it to a serving lad that he might hasten to make it ready. Then he fetched cream and milk and the young ox that he had made ready and placed it before them. Now he stood over against them under the tree while they ate. This is a lot of prep time, folks. This wasn't a 5-minute setup. This wasn't putting something in the microwave. Okay? This would have been hours and hours to get the ox, make it ready, get the cream, get all of this stuff. This is remarkable what he and his wife did for these 3 mystery men. And I want you to notice it's more than even he said he would do. What he told them was essentially, wash your feet, here's some water, and here's some bread. And then he gets this young ox, and he gets this cream and this milk. This reminds me so much of the prodigal son feast. When the father saw that his son had come back, he said, pull out all the stops. We are going to have a celebration, because this is what you do. You go big when you see what God does. This is what Abraham does. He goes huge because he's got the Lord right here in his presence. And so he throws this huge feast. And then do you notice he didn't join him? He doesn't pull up to the table at the head of the table and sit down and say, all right, dig in. He actually separates himself from them. This is true hospitality. He is only doing this for them, not for him. Shows incredible deference and respect. Hospitality is when you come in and you make it clear to that other person, this is about you. You are here for us to serve you. You are here for us to help you, to bless you. And that's what Abraham and Sarah are doing for these three guys. And in response in verse 9, they said to him, "Where's Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "Here, in the tent." Oh, come on, Abraham, get your wife involved, man. I'd be like, yeah, she's in here, let me get her out. She's the one who helped make all of this for you, right? But he doesn't do that. This is a very patriarchal society, and so he just says, she's back in there. But at least now they know she's here, and they know that she can hear them. Verse 10, "Now he said," one of the three men said, "I'll return, yes, return to you when time revives, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. So for the first time, we have a specific prophecy about this child. Where we've had multiple interactions here between God and Abraham, and with Hagar, yes, and with Sarah, and it's usually you're just going to have a lot of kids. There's going to be a seed. There's going to be a ton of them, but nothing about when. Now we've got some when. "I will return at a set time, and your wife Sarah will have a son." And then in verse 11 it clarifies, "And Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in days. The way of women had ceased for Sarah." And this is put in not for us to look down upon them, but to make it clear that it is naturally impossible for Sarah to have a child. This is to remind us that literally on her own accord, the way of women had ceased inside of her. It would not be possible, according to science and nature, for this woman to have a child. And this is exactly where God shines. And this is exactly why we're told in the Bible, don't see as the world sees. Think about it. So today, even today, the oldest recorded age of a natural mother is 59 years old. There's a 59-year-old lady who naturally became pregnant and naturally had a child. Any volunteers? I don't think so. Right? Sarah's 90. 90. That's way over 59. This is exactly where God shows up and shines, when he does things that the world says are impossible. And so for us, that should help us see even our own situations. Don't look at it the way the world sees it. How might God be present? How might God do something remarkable in a situation that the world says is impossible? It's exactly when God shows up. Verse 12. Sarah laughed within herself, saying, "After I've become warned, is there to be pleasure for me? And my Lord is old." So many shots at Abraham's age. So I want you to notice, though, about the Sarah laugh. Everyone loves the Sarah laugh. The Sarah laugh, and you're going to see this from the chapter, it still makes people laugh. But she laughed within herself. She didn't fall on the ground laughing. This isn't a belly laugh. It's not even really an auditory chuckle. It's just a laugh inside of herself, and guess who heard it? God. She's not even there. She's behind a tent, right? And he hears her. We have got to be so careful, even with our internal feelings about God. I don't want to process with you because I want to understand the extent of this. When we talk about dealing with each other and being in a relationship with each other, usually we think, hey, so-and-so doesn't know what I haven't told him. So I might feel a certain thing about you, but if I don't tell you, I can generally presume you don't know that because I haven't expressed it, I haven't shown it. Not with God. It doesn't matter what you say or what you do. He knows exactly what's going on up here, and he knows exactly what's going on in here. So be careful. This is why we're told to search our hearts, to search our minds. What is going on inside of you and your feelings about God? Because he knows, and he hears even our internal laughs. And we know he knows because of what happened in 13 and 14. But Yahweh said to Abraham, "Now why does Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I really give birth now that I am old? Is anything beyond Yahweh? At that set time I will return to you when time revives, and Sarah will have a son.'" I picture Abraham here like, she did laugh? Right? Because remember, Sarah laughed within herself. And yet Yahweh says to Abraham, I hear everything, and I hear these inmost feelings, and I've heard even what your wife laughed and said inside of herself. And so if God hears our inmost feelings, guys, might as well tell him. You might as well pray. Right? We know he knows. We know he sees in here and he sees in here. What he wants is for us to want to talk to him about it. He knows. He wants us to communicate with him about what's going on inside of our mind, inside of our heart. That's why prayer and communication with him is so important. But did you notice that he questioned Abraham? He didn't say, okay, Sarah, come out from behind the tent. He questions Abraham about his wife's reaction. This is a somewhat convicting reminder that a spouse is partially responsible for the faith of your spouse. Notice I just put partially, not completely. But that means that a spouse, and you should understand this whether you're married or not, this is a really important thing to know. Your spouse is partially responsible for the faith of your spouse. That means building it up, encouraging them, redirecting them with grace in love as necessary. That is the job of the husband, and that is the job of the wife, to encourage the faith of the spouse. That's why Abraham is questioned, not Sarah. And I love the question that's asked here. Is anything beyond Yahweh? And I put this up here because I want you guys to think about this. I want you to meditate on this. Is anything beyond Yahweh in your life right now, today? Any situation, any relationship, any obstacle that you've thought, oh God, I don't know how you're going to take care of that one. The answer to this question is, of course, no. Nothing is beyond Yahweh. And I hope that encourages you guys. Whatever it is that you feel like he might not be able to change, let him change it. He specializes in this. Verse 15, this is how Sarah responds. Sarah pretended otherwise, saying, no, I did not laugh. For she was afraid. But he said, no, indeed, you laughed. The men arose from there. I picture this like drop the mic moment when they call her out, right? And picture, she's not even there. She's like still in the tent. And she calls out, no, I didn't laugh. But why did she say that? She's afraid. Don't let fear make you lie. Ever. Fear, I think, is one of the number one causes of why people don't tell the truth. Because, yeah, the truth can sometimes be hard or uncomfortable. It might be hard for the speaker, it might be hard for the recipient, but the truth is always worth it. Always. Sarah could just have easily said, yeah, you caught me. How did you know what's going on inside of me? But it was her fear that caused her to lie. Don't let fear make you lie. The truth is always, always worth it. Now, before we get into chapter 20, I got to acknowledge Genesis chapter 19. This is one of those pictures worth 1,000 words kind of moments, all right? Doesn't really fit with the sermon where we've been and where we're going, but you got to understand that there was a Sodom and Gomorrah, was being the operative term, and there was a huge wipeout of those two cities, and as a part of that, God came down, really interesting test of God's justice and his grace, and God comes down and he wipes that out, but he says, I'm going to save Lot and his family, and some of the family goes and some of the family does not, and then God says, as you head out of town, whatever you do, don't look back. And unfortunately, Lot's wife didn't listen to that and became a large pillar of my favorite table seasoning. She became a huge pillar of salt. And for a long time, people wondered, why salt, right? And I don't know exactly, but I do know one of the things about salt. It's a preservative, and it especially was back then. And I know what this woman was doing. She was looking back, and I think there was a part of her that wanted to preserve her past, preserve her comfort zone, preserve what she knew. And God's like, don't do that. I need you moving forward. So that's what happens in chapter 19. That leads us to Genesis chapter 20. And in chapter 20, Abraham does a remarkably insane almost thing that he did before. And he goes to another area and he says, hey, Sarah, you know that whole sister thing we did before? Let's do that again. I'm going to call you my sister again. Even though what happened last time happened, right, that Pharaoh gets plagued and things get bad, they do it again. This time, God interceded through the king that they had lied to, this king Abimelech, and God has a very powerful encounter through this king, and God intercedes so there's no relationship between Sarah and the king. Because remember, at this point, God's made a promise to Abraham, and he's made a promise to Sarah. And so God intercedes, and he comes to the king, he says, hey, whatever you do, you don't want to go there, all right? So he intercedes on their behalf, and in response, get this, Abraham and Sarah receive land, oxen, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So just like what happened in Egypt, even after they pulled this move and they lied, they get rewarded and blessed again. It's almost mind-boggling to think about God's mercy and his grace on these two people. The other thing God did here is he made sure to restore Abimelech and his whole household. He wanted to make sure they were taken care of and they were okay, because remember, they didn't know anything was wrong. They didn't know that these two were married, and so God took care of them as well. Now all of that leads us to Genesis 21, verse 1, when we kind of zoom in on Sarah. Genesis 21, 1. Now Yahweh took account of Sarah as he had said. Yahweh dealt with Sarah as he had spoken. God keeps his promises every time. Just think about these two people, all that they'd done. All of their little side trips, all of the lies, all of the shenanigans. And God still keeps his promises. Even when we don't, he still does this today. Jesus has already gone to the cross. It's done. Knowing that we would continue to make mistakes, it is done. God keeps his promises. And so guess what that means? If we believe that we're created in the image of God, we should probably do that too. Even when the other person breaks their promise, we should probably keep our side of the deal. Now you might be thinking like me, like, well, wait a minute, hold on. If someone breaks their side of the deal, that means I'm out, right? That would be a major principle of like modern contract law, not the Bible. Our God believes in something greater than that, something more gracious than that, something more merciful than that. And if we're created in his image, and if we believe that he does that, we should probably be doing the same thing when people break their promises to us. We should be keeping our promises too. Verse 2, Sarah became pregnant and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And this kid shows up right on time. Right on time. Now, if you had asked Abraham and Sarah, they probably would have said, this kid is 23 years late, at least. Right? I mean, they had waited decades to have this child. And yet he's right on time. And I remind you guys of that because I think it's so important to think about where you're at and what it is that you want and what it is that you're hoping for. And I want you to loosen your hands a little bit. I want you to open up the schedule in your mind and say, okay, God, maybe not my timing. I want to make room for your timing. Because when he does this, he does it right on time. Verse 3, and Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Yitzhak, or he laughs. So Abraham here, even though he's acknowledging he's naming his kid, he laughs, which is a reminder to him forever that he laughed when he found out he was going to have a kid. He still complies. He says, okay, I'm going to name you Isaac, or he laughs. But folks, I want you to remember, his name is he laughs, not she laughs. Always remember Abraham's reaction to this. We love the Sarah story. We love that she laughed within herself. We got to remember that Abraham laughed first, loudest, with his face on the ground. And so this child's name is he laughs. And God is going to repurpose this laughter and do something joyous with it. Verse 4, and Abraham circumcised Isaac, his son, at 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And we are going to move right along from that one. But it is important for you guys to know that he did keep the covenant that God had put in place, and he did this with his son Isaac. And then we're told in verse 5 that Abraham was 100 years old when Yitzhak, his son, was born to him. 100-year-old dad. Guys, this would be a reality TV show today. Think about it. It would be like, my dad's older than your great-grandfather, or something, right? If we had 100-year-old dad with a baby, this would be all over the television. So you can imagine what it meant back then. You got a 100-year-old dad of a baby and a 90-year-old mother. And that wonderful 90-year-old mother said this in verse 6. Now Sarah said, God's made laughter for me. All who hear of it will laugh for me. And I want you to notice how she says this. They're going to laugh for me. Which reminds me of that expression, we're not laughing at you, right? We're laughing with you. She's saying, God has actually brought laughter and joy into my life. This is why when we tell the story, even today, people chuckle and laugh. God is going to make laughter for me. Look what he's done. He's turned her fear into laughter. He's turned her lies into laughter. He's turned her doubt into laughter. This is what God does. This is his grace. This is his mercy. I don't know if you guys have ever had a situation where you've been really anxious about something coming up. Might have been a little bit stressed about something coming up. And you prayed and prayed and prayed, and you're really concerned about it happening. Then it happens. And then it passes, and years later you look back, you're like, I can't believe I was stressed about that. This is sort of like that. God's turned all of her fear and her lies and her doubt into laughter and joy, and we still get to laugh about it today. And she said, who would have declared to Abraham, Sarah will nurse sons? Well, I've borne him a son in his old age. Lots of shots at how old her husband is, right? Who would have known? Who would have thought? In other words, God does the unbelievable. No one would have known. No one would have thought other than God. This is what he does. Make room for God to do the unbelievable. The stuff that even we might not believe is possible is quite possible for our God. Now, all that we've talked about leads up to Genesis 22. So here's this couple. They've moved to a place they didn't even know where they were going. They're told they're going to have kids, and they wait and wait and wait, and they try to have a kid another way. And then they have this child, this blessed child of promise, and God comes one day to Abraham. And it says he tested him. God tested Abraham. And I want you to offer up to me, Abraham, your only son. Because remember, Ishmael's gone, and he's got his one son, and God comes, I want you to sacrifice for me your son. I got to tell you guys, because I am blessed to have a son. If God came to me and said, Scott, I want your son, I shudder to think of how I would react. What I would feel inside of me, what I might say. I'd be like, my son? You want my son? Take me. Like, not my son. Why do you want my son? And Abraham did it. He said, okay, Lord, and he actually bound up his son. He actually led him down that road. He pulled up the knife. He had the knife over his son. He was ready to comply. And then God steps in. This messenger shows up and stops him and says, no, you don't have to sacrifice your son. And what he said on that day, and he's still saying today, is this: not your son, my son. That day, God says, you don't have to sacrifice your son. I've made the sacrifice for you. And he did it in the person of Jesus Christ, his one and only beloved son. And that's where we're going. That's why we celebrate Palm Sunday. That's why we remember Good Friday. That's why we're going to be here on Resurrection Sunday, praising the Lord. Because God said, not my son, not your son, my son. And as we take communion this morning, I want you guys to think about, we get a chance to commune with that promised son. And I encourage you to remember that God gave up his son for ours. Let's pray, and then we'll take communion this morning. Father God, we thank you so much for the path you've led us on this year. Just remembering, reflecting on the perfection of your creation, your repeated mercy and grace on your people, even after all the mistakes we've made, your promises and your covenants to people who are imperfect just like us. And you have continued to keep your promises, and you cemented it through what your Son, Jesus Christ, did on that cross so long ago. Right now, God, we pause to remember you, Jesus, and what you did on that day. As we take the bread, we remember the body of Jesus broken for us. As we take the cup, We remember the blood of Jesus poured out for us. Your Son, God, not ours. We thank you, we love you, and it's in Jesus' name we do this and pray. Amen.